Welcome back to what's meant to be a very innovative and transforming session. I want to start with a trip to memory lane. I want to remember the first time I was invited to speak at OIS Retina. And it wasn't that far away. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And back then, we were already doing artificial intelligence for clinical trials. Nonetheless, I was invited to speak with what was called something different, or let's do something innovative. And indeed, it was a very nice session with a lot of forward-thinking statements. Now, it's very nice to be here with esteemed colleagues and some of the scientists that are really driving transformation in clinical trials. And there's nothing we're going to talk today that's forward-thinking per se, or is wishful thinking or pie in the sky. What we're going to discuss today is really concrete utilization of AI for clinical trials. So I will share the take-home message before we even start. Anyone in this room that's not using AI for clinical trials is falling behind. So many thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm going to start with a quick round of introductions, but this panel needs no introduction. So I'm going to ask you is please let the group here know what's the problem or the key problem that you're trying to solve with AI for clinical trials.
Thanks for having me, Daniela. I'm Ehsan. I'm the CEO of Toku. Toku is the first company that is taking an AI diagnostic tool through the FDA in the oculomics field. Our AI that is now going through its FDA trial is about identifying cardiovascular risk using retinal images. And we sort of have to match our standards to American Heart Association when it comes to cardiovascular risk. Going back to your question about what is the problem that we are trying to solve, we're actually trying to get an AI through clinical trials. So the AI is the subject of the clinical trial. And I will talk about it a little bit later, but there are things that you can improve as part of a clinical trial using AI, but if the AI is the product, then FDA has a lot of extra questions around it. So I'll get to that later on.
We're going to get into that. Dr. Chang?
I'm Dolly Chang. I am the Chief Scientific Officer at Kodiak Sciences. And we are a clinical stage company with 3 assets in the phase 3 clinical trials. So I think that the biggest challenge is to, when you conduct clinical trials, especially with our molecule that is biopolymer conjugated to extend the durability, I think one of the biggest challenges is that how do you assess durability in a clinical trial? And typically that determines on how do you set the retreatment criteria in a protocol. And that may be very different from retina specialist practice in a clinical setting. So for example, we generally set a single number, CST or BCVA, as the criteria for retreatment criteria. When you translate into the clinic, that's just not how we practice. We look through the B scan, we look at the fluid at every part of the retina, every single layer, and then so the durability that you study in a clinical trial doesn't really translate into the clinical practice setting. So I think that one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is that we know that it is literally impossible to manually grade every single B scan by reading center in a real time when you conduct clinical trial. We also know that if you leave this decision to the clinical sites, then you introduce a lot of variability, inconsistency as well. So I think that we're going to talk a little bit about how do you integrate AI into the decision making for retreatment in something like a registrational study, for example, Daybreak in wet AMD, that we currently are conducting.
Thank you so much. I'll definitely get back to that. Dr. Patel?
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. My name is Shriji Patel. I'm a medical director at Genentech. I think Genentech, being a large pharma company, has to deal with its own separate set of problems. And so when we think about how we're integrating AI into drug discovery, it's really, I think, twofold. One, using AI to reduce burden and kind of iron out processes, simplifying and streamlining, decreasing the time from NME to authorization so that we can get drugs to patients faster, but then also not just kind of day-to-day reduction in burden, but long-term, thinking about how we can do this better. Understanding targets, understanding how they interact with disease tissues, earlier on in the process, failing if we need to, so that we can push higher potential assets to late stage, invest our resources in a way that makes most sense. Just to kind of, we all know drug development is a tough sport, 90% failure rate across the industry. And so being able to reduce that, I think, and leveraging the benefits of AI kind of with the scope of a long-term view, I think those are the key ways that Genentech's trying to incorporate AI into the drug development.
Thank you. I'll definitely get back to both of you because you mentioned about being successful faster, but also failing faster. Dr. Toker?
Thank you. Ben Toker, co-founder and president of Amaros, and we are a precision intelligence company, and we work with 5 different data sets under the same umbrella. We unify them, and these are EHR, providers' notes, claims data, and genetics, as well as the imaging, multimodal imaging data, which helps us on the biomarker analysis side as well. So combination of all gives us an opportunity to identify patients at the clinic level and matching all the criteria automatically without requiring necessarily coordinators or administrators' attention. So one of the challenges was for the clinical trial is to not only identify more patients, but decreasing the screen fail rate and automate it in such a way that the coordinators don't worry about that and they can focus on the patient education, patient recruitment.
Hold that thought. I'll get back to that. Dr. Wykoff?
All great topics. Great to be here with all of you. Charlie Wykoff, retina specialist practicing Houston, Texas, part of a large platform of retina specialists, 300+ doctors across 23 states. We have about 2.5 million patient visits a year. And so I'd bring up AI in our context in 2 ways. One is for clinical trial identification for patients, so more effective, more efficient, a lot to unpack there. And then secondly, for us, we're very intentional over multiple months at looking for partners to help us collate our data. Right? You have the EMR data, you have the imaging data. There's lots of companies really good at the EMR data. There's very few companies trying to bridge those, and none do it well yet. A lot of interest there in doing it. So we then pivoted and began creating our own internal system. So we've put a lot of energy and resources over the last 1.5 years into creating an internal system to collate the data, and actually modeling that after Pierce Keene's work out of London. Important for us all not to reinvent the wheel when possible. And so we've learned from previous experiences and put a lot of energy into that, not only for trial work, but also, right, when you think about trials, in my mind, real-world data is almost as important and maybe one day more important. And so we're trying to get to a place where we can reliably analyze real-world data in a very effective way.
Thank you for this. Even though our session is focused on clinical trials, you bring such an important perspective, which is the bridge between clinical trials and clinical practice. So we'll get back to that. I'm Daniela Ferrara. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Topcon Healthcare, and I'm super thrilled to be moderating this session. So Dolly, back to you. Kodiak has been one of the pioneering companies using AI in clinical trials, not only external third-party collaborators, algorithms, but you have an innovation group that also has some in-house developments. So would you share with the group today what drove Kodiak to implement AI in clinical trials, and what are some of the main insights? You mentioned CST, but guide us through more into your development practice.
Yeah, I think that Kodiak is a really interesting company that a lot of people know us based on the platform that we built, which is the ABC platform, biopolymer conjugate. And what that means is that when you conjugate to an antibody, you extend the half-life. Now we have human data that the half-life can extend to 20 days, for example. And then that is about 3 times longer than regular antibody. So that's great science. Then when we want to translate into clinical trial, we talk about, how do you design a trial? And we know the limitation of CST. Some patients that already have disease activation outside of central 1 millimeter, but then doesn't fit the retreatment criteria and such. So, what we're really trying to bring is a clinical trial that is closer to clinical practice. But then at the same time that, we want to use an AI tool, but it is a risk that people are going to take. So how we do that is that we started to assess the AI OCT fluid tool. Then we apply into our previous clinical trial, more than 1,000 patients, more than 200,000 data points. We look at different fluid biomarker. We have internal validation of these algorithms before we implement them. Then we set up the algorithm for disease retreatment criteria, make sure that it's sensitive enough to pick up the patient who need to be treated, but at the same time reducing the noise based on the cutoff that you pick. Then we were like, great, we have this algorithm now. How are we going to implement into the clinical trial? And it's introducing new technology into a busy clinical flow is never that easy, right? So even though we have this great tool, I think that it requires a lot of the training with the sites, walking through the photographer, how to implement, you upload the photos into the platform, and then how do you coordinate with the reading center, for example. Then we implemented a clinical trial now that a lot of sites told us that, this is a great tool, we find it easy to use. But that's part of that. That is clinical trial. I think that the other question that we have is, okay, if the trial read out positive, how do you monitor the patients at home and then really, implement the same type of AI algorithm, decision-making treatment into, day-to-day practice or patients' lives. So in our company that we also have a digital health department and trying to develop wearable and integrating with AI and such, that hopefully that will, launch along with or in later time with the drug so that it can hand in hand in terms of, providing a whole patient care experience.
Thank you. I love that because what you're sharing is not really advice, it's best practices. And if I could summarize, you started from retrospective, low-risk integration of AI in your design, and then you used for power, and then you move for the live trial. And Shriji, Genentech has been developing in-house tools as well, very successfully. Would you share with us along the same lines, main scientific insights, how the in-house AI algorithms and solutions have been impacting the best practices in your group?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that don't know, Daniela actually paved the way for a lot of the work that's been done at Genentech with AI. And so maybe I should be asking you that question. But Genentech benefits from having a wealth of data that's been collected, clinical data and imaging data through years and years of clinical trials. And so, we all know that what AI feeds on is data, right? That's the kind of lifeblood of AI. And so by feeding that into our systems and being able to generate AI algorithms and then training on those data sets and then being able to validate them with reading center read images, for example, we're able to create these high sensitivity, high specificity, reads that really correlate well with what we see, if we get something from a reading center, for example. And then what that allows us to do is to internally look at our data from, let's say, earlier stage, for example, and be able to accelerate our understanding about what we're seeing, whether these efficacy kind of findings actually correlate with anatomic findings, for example. And to the point I was making earlier about failing fast, being able to early on identify, yes, we're seeing a signal, this is something that can compete in a very competitive space, or no, we're just not seeing the effects that we might be seeing if we just look kind of superficially at the data. And so already I think there's been quite a lot that's been kind of insights we've been able to glean from our own AI algorithms, some of which has been published and even going to be presented at various meetings this year. And I think that as we continue to develop these algorithms and refine them further, and then, to Charlie's point, incorporating real-world data sets and really kind of seeing if we can refine them even further to make them bridge some of the gap from what we see in clinical trials to, what we see in the real world. And so I think that again, the data is clearly the key, and luckily at Genentech, we have just tons and tons of data.
Daniela, can I make a brief comment? I just want to applaud, Genentech, Kodiak, ONL Therapeutics. There's many companies now trying to incorporate these algorithms into not only the screening process, but the retreatment process. And I think it's super important. And if you're a company designing trials and you're not looking at these algorithms to guide retreatment or enrollment, you're missing the boat. I would strongly encourage you to look at them. There's 2 really good ones out there now. There's probably more that are very close, but there's 2 that are usable right now that are very effective. Just speaking from experience from the Daybreak trial, coordinators have been very happy with it. It's very efficient, very effective, and most importantly, for the rest of us, it's standardizing now how we retreat this. It's taking the subjectivity out of it and quantifying it in the way that you're going to be able to really better understand the data. Other thing we need to move forward there on is not just CST, but getting past that to more of these complex fluid analytics. You know, Christina Wang is leading a beautiful trial, the DRCR-AO, which is also going to teach us a lot about fluid analytics. The Daybreak trial, there's a lot of these. So think more holistically about fluid in your trials than just CST. You're missing a lot of data.
So summarizing the sentiment here, what we are saying is using AI is enabling, we're specifically talking about retinal imaging analysis, it's enabling endpoints, power calculation, inclusion-exclusion criteria. That's just not possible without automation. So even though all those algorithms, they are validated, and I'll get to Ehsan's point on the validation of AI-based tools, they are validated against the human as gold standard. But we're truly in the edge that very soon, when we're starting with the ellipsoid zone, for example, or intraretinal fluid, the endpoints are moving towards a state that it must be automated. But before I go back to retinal imaging with oculomics, Ehsan, Ben, tell us a little bit about no-imaging endpoints and AI for other types of data that you alluded before, beyond imaging.
We've seen that the combo is the best way to do it. Imaging is one, which I'm sure he'll mention that very nicely in a second. But when we connect the dots with the EMR provider's notes, which plays we believe it's one of the important element to it, it allows us to understand the behavior of the physicians as well, their style, their approach, aggressive treaters or not, and vice versa. That helps in the recruitment phase as well for this. So connecting the dots with claims as a guarantor, if you will, or confirmation, and biomarker analysis, it's a game changer. And I would say that to Charles' point as well, that it's the drug journey. We believe it's the best way from criteria design, site selection, and the recruitment. It's not just the recruitment by itself.
And adding to the very concrete statement then, beyond retinal imaging, it's integration with EMR and claims and genetics and omics. And
the notes, provider notes, that plays a big role because we have to create multiple algorithms for each of them. Giving an example, for the provider notes, it was a large language models to understand as opposed to visual computing for the images. And the content understanding and the intent of the content has been quite challenging, but but it's a ton of gold of information in there.
I could spend all day talking about algo development, but I think your take-home message here is that you need tools that are fit for purpose.
Yes.
It's hard to get off the shelf some of those tools.
I believe so, yeah.
Yes. So back to you, Ehsan. We're talking about integration of data, and your group and a few other groups worldwide have been leading a whole new scientific field that the term has been recently coined, oculomics, which is basically using retinal images to make prediction of systemic diseases. And I think every clinician in the room has been doing this with diabetes, hypertension, neurological conditions, but now AI takes to a whole new level again. So tell us a little bit, you're mentioning before, how to validate an algorithm that no human can make the prediction for.
That's actually a very good point. So first of all, you got to start with the gold standard. What is the gold standard? So in our case, for example, the algorithm that is now, we have gone through the FDA, got the breakthrough designation, and now we're going with a full de novo. The diagnosis is a elevated cardiovascular risk, which is a particular term in cardiology. So you start with cardiology, although this algorithm is developed in ophthalmology and eye care. You start with cardiology, you speak to the cardiologist, you understand where their gold standards are. We brought in experts from American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology. You set the standard, you get an agreement with them, and then you come to the eye care industry and say, okay, now that we've figured out the gold standard, how do we implement it here? At the end of the day, the oculomics is the connection between an eye visit and everything else outside. So you have to speak both languages. You have to speak to the eye doctor about a cardiac event or a kidney failure. So again, we are repeating that with our second product, which is about chronic kidney condition. Again, we have brought in experts from the National Kidney Foundation. Let's figure out the gold standard for a nephrologist, and let's then train the AI in eye care to then match that standard outside. So these AIs, and I want to go back to what the problem is. When the product is the AI, your product is to work with, the problem is to work with the FDA. Because FDA has its own, different offices of the FDA have different sort of attitudes toward the AI, and I didn't know that. The Office of Ophthalmology and the Office of Cardiology at the FDA are very progressive when it comes to AI. They've sort of figured out there are rules, regulations to go by it. But for example, the Office of Nephrology, not that much. So, you're talking to the same organization, but different offices have different attitudes. So you have to understand that. Cybersecurity is one of the biggest problems in AI. When we talk about clinical trials and AI, I don't know how big of a problem is the cybersecurity side. When you're actually going through the clinical trial for an AI product, then cybersecurity is by far the highest rank. And the other problem, and we're talking about problems with the AI and clinical trials, is bias. Bias in AI is real. And again, when you're dealing with the FDA, they have detailed protocols about how you identify bias, how you mitigate bias. So all of those are things that when you do these things with the FDA and you work with them, you sort of try to understand the problem.
Yeah, so again, I think what's top of mind is cybersecurity, patient privacy, and all the engine behind the scenes.
Cool.
The algorithms are the tip of the iceberg. Yes.
I can tell you the science of the AI is the easiest part.
Yes.
When you get to cybersecurity, it's a much harder problem. Yeah.
Yes, and actually you mentioned this before, Charlie, how much your group has been investing in infrastructure for data sets. Your group has been at the forefront of using AI from the drug developer, clinical trialist site, gold standard site in AI. Please share with us your perspective in your journey so far, and I will ask you to focus on an aspect that you alluded briefly. It's a subtle but very transformative transition we're living now, because for the first time, we can really do evidence-based medicine. We all claim to do evidence-based medicine, but how can we really translate what we see in a clinical trial, in a publication, or presentation to the patient in front of us, now having the same tool for clinical trial and to using the patient in front? This is really evidence-based medicine. How are you navigating this?
Thank you. Certainly a team approach. There's a lot of groups working on this. So it's very collaborative in many ways. There are a lot of challenges there, and I'll just list some of them that come to mind. One is hardware. So you have some hardware manufacturers that play well in the sandbox, and you have others that don't, and we'll leave the names off the table in the discussion now. But some create things in DICOM format that you can easily export and then analyze. Others don't. That's a real obstruction to moving the field forward. I would strongly encourage you to use formats that we all can access. It just is the logical thing to do. Secondly is, we talk a lot about algorithms, and the algorithms where we are for current analysis with retrospective overlay are super important, but I think will be really useful to help communicate to patients the value of a trial and the value of current therapeutics is to project, so to prognosticate. And you're talking about this a little bit with cardiology, but we need it just in retina also. So show me what the GA lesion is going to look like over time. And then there's some pharmaceutical companies looking, there's some devices soon I think that are going to come out that are going to be able to overlay that structural progression with functional deficits over time. Because I actually believe the current 2 GA therapeutics are actually meaningful in the space. As much as they get a bad rap, I actually use a decent amount of them. I think they're useful for patients, but I think we're terrible at quantifying that value. Just because we can't quantify it doesn't mean it's not there. I feel strongly about that, and I know they get a bad rap, so I'll let that go. But the last issue is that there's inconsistency with the way that we image in clinic. So in clinical trials, high-density B scans, very reliable. In clinical practice, it's all over the place. There's star patterns. There's all these single-line rasters people do. You got to do consistent volume scanning. So if you're a physician out there, I strongly encourage you to find one of the efficient volume scans that's being used in clinical practice, clinical trials, and adopt it to your practice. It's not going to slow down your flow. Once your photographers get used to it, you'll be fine. But I think being able to have the good data going in makes all the difference.
So I'll try to paraphrase what you're sharing is imaging and data that's good for humans or good for the way we've been practicing medicine, not necessarily is the best type of imaging or big data. When it comes to big data and AI, it's just different parameters. And this topic came in previous panels. The GA panel was mentioning how even in clinical trials, half the data was useless for AI.
It's challenging. I'll give you one more example. So we were searching our database for severe events from one of the on-label anti-complement therapeutics, and we found 2 severe events. But it actually turns out that there was one more, but that one wasn't captured because the coding wasn't accurate. So you're so reliant on all these little details, and if you miss 1 or 2 cases in a big data set for a rare event, it changes everything. So we need to figure out ways to confirm these algorithms are actually going to be consistent over time in different analyses.
So you're going back to the multimodal data. So anchored in imaging, because that's the retina world, and that's where we base our clinical trial design and our best practices at the point of care, but leverage AI also for multimodal information. So I'm going to ask you, each one of you, to close. Let's talk about, we talked about the good. Let's talk about the bad and the ugly then. But I want to leave in a high note. So share with us what's concerning you the most, what would be the most important call out for all of us here implementing AI in clinical trials, but how you're overcoming this.
So I think going too fast and not going fast enough, get the balance right. AI is useful if it's done purposefully and thoughtfully. So yes, we have to develop tools and use them as quickly as possible, but we shouldn't undermine cybersecurity and privacy just because we want to use AI. So just get the speed right. I think that's the main challenge.
Thank you. Dolly?
For me, I think that I've been interested in AI since maybe like 2018, 2017. I think that it has helped us a lot in terms of those kind of manual work, help with the efficiency, things like that. That has been great. We talk about Daybreak trial. I think what I haven't found that progress as fast as we wish is that if you look at the Tesla, FSD, every single version update is so amazing. You can drive your car even without, touching the wheel. But then I feel like in terms of like disease prediction or like really breakthrough transformative application, I'm hoping to see that over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Shriji?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that AI is as good as what it's built upon, right? And so if you give it bad data or biased data, that's just going to propagate forward, and you're going to end up kind of veering far off course than where you thought you might end up. And so really, I think AI is the future. You said this. I think we can all agree that it's going to be inextricably linked to drug development, but it requires appropriate supervision, and it needs to be intentional. So it's not a substitute for kind of the critical thinking that's been going on for years and decades in drug development, but it's an adjunct to help and to kind of accelerate and kind of give us insights that otherwise we would not have been able to kind of glean,
Thank you for saying this, because for the past decade that our research groups, including our collaborative research groups, have been developing AI, both for clinical trials and clinical practice, not rarely a colleague comes to me and say, how dare you? You're taking the experts, and that couldn't be further away from the truth. Then final remarks.
For me, it's AI plus human in the loop. I think AI is great, meaning there are ways to do these things in a way that we describe right now. From our end, the challenge that what we see is we give precise information to act on to the coordinators or administrators, like giving, let's say, 100% qualified 25 patients. Just the workflow, it's tough for them. We still have to work with the coordinators in a good way. I'm not putting down any coordinators or administrators here. The challenge is the workflow has to be adjusted to AI and the capability of AI as well. Otherwise, it's still just a hypothetical is what we see.
Thank you. Charlie, as a retina specialist, to close this session on clinical trials.
All great comments. I think that my one thought here is just where I started, which is there's a lot of companies able to mine EMR data in isolation, and that's super valuable, but we have to move past that and to really focus on being able to bring in the imaging in a high-quality way. Not just the easy imaging, but we got to figure out how to integrate and collate imaging with EMR longitudinally to make this at the next level. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for paving the way. Thank you for pushing forward the field. Can't wait to see what you're going to do next. Thank you.
Thank you.